welcome to Future Fossils podcast. My name is Michael Garfield.
And I am Evan Snyder, and we have two very special guests tonight. We are very stoked to have Mr. Anthony and Mr. David, and we will divulge more information about both these individuals as the podcast moves forward, but they are both exceptional wizardry-oriented people. So we're in good company tonight. We're looking forward to talking to them about their most recent projects. And Anthony, I know you just were in the process of rolling out your new Earthcry release, and I just listened to that today for the first time all the way through. Really enjoyed it, man.
Thank you. Yeah. It's not as immediate as it might seem. Like most of that stuff is pretty old, actually. I almost finished it before the first album came out. Some of the more strange, wiggly kind of stuff is more recent. I had a pretty large body of music that I made, but I didn't feel as if it was like really. I kind of had one of those like side project career crises where I was like, am I even? What is the point of this? Is there's so much music in this persuasion of music that I'm creating that like, is this even worth releasing? And I had all these songs kind of sitting around. I kind of got a burst of inspiration when I started messing with the modular synthesis kind of thing that's happening now, and has been happening for a while, but it made me want to go back to those other songs and sync the thing up and like mangle the audio and like do new things with it. And I started to create sounds I hadn't heard before, and that's kind of like my favorite thing. Like it's the most inspirational thing is when you are creating something you haven't heard before. And I felt like I was able to take those songs and kind of resurrect them with new sounds. And then I felt like good enough about, oh, okay, cool. Like this is worthy. This is worthwhile to put a lot more time into. And then I sank a lot more time into it. And then so you're hearing on the album kind of the 4 years worth of different songs. I don't know about you guys, but when you create stuff, do you have like blah 1 through 776, like, or just like you take your keyboard and just like hit a bunch of keys real fast and push enter because you just don't know what to call anything anymore? Because that's kind of what happens to me. And I just do it. And I just kind of went back through a lot of those, and I've decided now I'm going to have a better way of keeping track of everything. But I just kind of resurrected my favorite ones of blah, like 620 or something, and then those ended up becoming like what they are.
Nice. Well, I personally like have a running Evernote of all the different things that I want to call a track at some point, potentially. So, however, like the alternative route is kind of the Autechre script of basically just mashing your keyboard and naming that as your project or your track or iteration or whatever it might be. And it's kind of ironic because they actually named a couple pieces of my gear, and they named them Orinoco and the Splund, respectively, which seems rather premeditated. So I don't know exactly what they meant by that. The Splund is a memory man with Hazarai from Electroharmonics. So I guess they approach it from multiple angles as well, depending on their inspiration.
I was going to say that I go back and forth between the two extremes of knowing exactly what the song name is and writing to that song, and then finishing a song and having such a painstakingly hard time figuring out what that song is called. So I've had the range of experience with the song naming there.
I want to use this as the opportunity. It seems like a pattern is emerging in this conversation, and we might as well trace it while it's floating in the air before us, which is that I've been reading a lot of crazy futurist nonfiction lately. Kevin Kelly has a new book out, and Martine Rothblatt, who invented Sirius XM satellite radio, has a book about digital immortality and uploading. And I've been reading these books together, which is a super trippy experience. And one of the things I keep thinking about is how both of these authors assert that the more we play around in digital spaces, the more we're leaving a kind of a shadow or an image of ourselves in digital space that can be then used as a kind of mirror. Anthony, you and I were talking about before this call about like, I give myself to Google and then Google sells it back to me. But it's like beyond that. The reason that they're able to make this effective sale is because this image of you is so precise. And so I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about stuff that I'm never going to read, like all of these videos I'm never going to get to. All of these file management, creative workflow things that you guys are talking about are everyone's like unique attempt to manage the flood of ideas. And so in a way, it's like, you know, that old joke about how, well, I need to clone myself. I need to make like 3 more of me if I'm going to pursue all of these projects. But there's this thing about it, which is that we may actually be getting really close to being able to spin off a version of yourself that isn't really quite you, but is like all of the songs that you never actually wrote and got back to, like all of the articles that you never read, and like you like create like an alternate reality version of you that has like an entirely different record catalog and like college education. I don't know.
Well, to go from there, okay, so that just makes me think of, what if all of these digital creation applications had something built into it where it was tracking all of our decisions, all of our equalization decisions, compression decisions, composition decisions. I'm speaking just in musical terms. You could apply it to, you know, any type of visual media or anything else. And eventually the program created a profile of you that was so predictive of what you might do that, you know, you said, wow, I would have thought of that. Thanks for thinking of that. And that's exactly like a multiple parallel computational versions of yourself.
My presets.
Yeah.
I love all my little presets, these alternate versions of me. But like, it really is, this is like a Doug Rushkoff present shock thing. You know, so it's curious to me, Anthony, that you talk about this album as being a bunch of stuff that you sort of dropped and then you got back to, because the first Earthcry album was very like conceptual and precise and like down to, you know, using solfeggio frequencies and like retuning your synthesizers. That time, that emphasis on time was about this micro scale. But now you've emerged into this sort of larger set of feedback loops where you're going back years and reaching like back and forward through time and like different like Mac OS X time machine archives of yourself and like bringing stuff forward and backward.
Somewhat of a task, because you always have, that was like 4 laptops ago or something, and all the plugins that I had at the time were gone. Yeah, so like I've never made sense of naming, because by the time it becomes something close to release, I've renamed it at least twice, because I renamed it what I thought it was going to be the second time, and then by the time I see it like written out, I'm like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. And then you have to figure out which one was the session that you named that you wanted to use that had the plugins that you did have on the right computer. I think this is a funny name for this, the future fossils. I feel like even back in the day I was doing that. And I don't have the same necessary plugins that I had back then, because I have a terrible affliction known as gear acquisition syndrome. I consistently am acquiring new software and then like not updating the laptop that I used before, and I have actual like fossilized artifacts known as old laptops that barely work, that sometimes I have to try to like get them to work just long enough to get the set off of there, or like, you know, flatten the WAV files down so that I can like grab them. And I'm really looking forward to being able to work on the next thing, because I'm not going to do that to myself.
You really think that it's not going to be upgrading constantly for the rest of our lives? Because that's really what it's starting to feel like for me, that it's like we're moving out of the like liquid and into the gaseous phase. And then it's just like, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to automatically accept all the new permissions every day, you know, just...
Well, going back really quick to like the protocol of you know, pulling up old project files and such, this is something I run into pretty frequently, and Anthony, you were just talking about as well. I'm sure David and you, Michael, are pretty well experienced in this too, but like when you open something that's not reverse compatible, like the project will not load in your new version of Ableton or Pro Tools or whatever, and you got to go through and like see if you can pull up your old version of whatever that DAW or software might be. Like the overall process, maybe the project itself is 2 years old and kind of stale, and what if there was like a algorithm that could actually go through and rebuild and sort of create a new version of whatever you were creating based upon what you had created, And there are like algorithms like that are able to, for instance, like mimic Beethoven or Bach based upon their style, like just digesting the algorithms and the processes through the waveforms of what's been created, you know, the compositions that people have made. So maybe at some point we'll have something that can go through our old projects after we've disappeared and turned into fossils ourselves that can actually extrapolate out what our finished project might have been like, or for their own enjoyment, they'll be able to remix it based on that, you know?
Well, that brings up an interesting thought for me because, you know, whenever I open up a project that's 2 or 3 years old, I instantly kind of get transported back to that moment, those moments in time that I was creating it, and I sort of insert my consciousness into my earlier self. Whatever was happening for me at that time, it sort of becomes this bridge through time, not only when writing the track, but, you know, if I play a track out live that I haven't played in a couple years or something like that, I sort of re-embody the process that I was going through as I was writing that. So, Anthony, I'm curious, and Michael, I'm especially curious how this works for you, because most of your songs seem to be these ongoing sort of recapitulations of themselves as you play them live often. But, Anthony, I'm curious how that was for you, going back and pulling up old tracks that were created by an earlier version of yourself.
yeah, it's definitely like, I definitely probably wouldn't even write a lot of music the same way that I did then. And yeah, it's Michael, maybe we were talking about this. We were talking about how like 2012 was like the headiest year of everyone's life, you know? Like, at that point there was supposed to be some sort of like multicolored feathered winged serpent that was going to come down and like change everything. That same year, so many things happened to us, and I listened to music that I made then, and it's a little more like cheesy mystical than I think I would create now. Those were the tracks that I'm talking about. Like that first one, Transdimensional Camel Ride, is definitely like that, you know? And like now I have sank into, as a person, just kind of more of a, I don't know how to even put this, maybe more of a grounded or practical like mindset about things, and I think it's come out in my music. I'm just trying to create sonic novelty that can add value to the electronic music community, and that's kind of like where I'm operating out of. And I still have, you know, there's still my, like, I guess you could call it like heady, you know, mystical aspect, but it's not the dominant driving force. And so I think that might be like the biggest difference that I'm experiencing now, you know, between now and then. And like, to tie it all together, I wonder, like David, you were saying how there could be like an algorithm that's collecting the different actions that we do. It'd be really interesting to like kind of have the same song and then run it through that system and see what 2012 Michael Garfield would create of his song versus 2016 Michael Garfield, you know what I mean? Like, and what the differences would be. And I would venture to say that it would be a little more heady mystical if it was 2012.
Oh, almost certainly. I mean, I believe at, what was it, 5:21 a.m. Mountain Time on December 21st, 2012, I was engaged in a sex magic ritual to bring about peace in the Middle East. So...
Michael, you failed us.
I'm sorry.
Well, not necessarily. It depends on your timeline and your sense of unfolding events. Hopefully, all should be well in Michael's sacrifice.
Actually, on that note, I'm going to send you guys an image through the Skype chat here that we ought to post in the show notes. I pulled this off of the Long Now Foundation website, and it shows this was an idea.
Oh yeah.
From Stuart Brand, and because we're talking about this about these different cycles that are all sort of like harmonics of other cycles. You know, the way that like Anthony's going back 4 years ago and digging up stuff and, you know, repurposing it now and invigorating it with a new vibe is structurally identical, although maybe not emotionally identical, to the way that I work in my shows, where, you know, I'll layer a bunch of stuff and then drop it out and then maybe bring it back in 5 minutes in a completely different context. And so this image from Long Now is of the various speeds of different natural cycles, and where it's like the longest, slowest wavelength is nature, like ecosystems. and then culture is a little smaller and faster, and then governance is a little faster still, and then infrastructure, and then commerce, and then the little 20,000 hertz harmonic on top of everything else is fashion. It's just like a little squiggly line running over that like long, slow bass note of the earth. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. And Stuart Brand, in the book Clock of the Long Now, talks about so much of our suffering as human beings comes from trying to apply leverage or influence on the wrong layer of that, hoping that fashion is going to change culture somehow, even though culture is like religion. And how is fashion going to change religion? It doesn't work that way. Thoughts?
I would argue that the fashion line on this particular graph, and maybe we can link in the comments for the podcast, is one in many squiggly lines, including perhaps commerce, freakonomics, infrastructure, the sort of build and bust cycle, governance, the perpetually non-compliant and low performance phenomena, maybe a bouncing sine wave at the very bottom of the y-axis. Culture looks pretty good as a solid line moving forward, I would like to think, and a bunch of spirals maybe referring back to prior moments and nostalgia and religion and spirituality. And nature is a continuous arrow as far as I can feel, but growing into a tree in multiple directions. So that first line that they have for fashion is pretty good, but the rest are not just straight arrows as far as I can tell. Maybe if we can make a new version, that could be really cool.
You are the squirrel living in my tree of possibilities, Evan.
Wow, that's the sweetest thing I've heard all day, man. Thank you very much. And I've had some great kisses from dogs and cats and hugs from people and high fives, and that was really nice. It definitely hit home, so thank you.
Yeah. Well, one thing I know that I really want to get into on this chat, if I can continue to sort of steer this nonsense, is that, Anthony, you, in regards to your new album, you said that working with modular synthesizers, like analog modular synthesizers on this round, a real different workflow for you, and that it was sort of like working or collaborating, I forget exactly how you put it, but you said it was like working with a living creature.
Yeah.
Talk about that, the experience of that, specifically how that differed from the other stuff that you've done in the past. I'm curious.
Well, I feel like in a lot of ways, so you play the acoustic guitar, and you can pretty much express yourself instantly on an acoustic guitar because you have the skill that it takes to do what your brain does right away. And I've always struggled with specifically using a laptop directly. It should be just a duh thing for me. It should be just I get this instrument that requires physical effort. I have to plug something into something else, route signal, think about how the signal's being routed, and I have to think about the process. There's going to be a novelty to it that you can only control so much. You may be able to pluck something even with some harmonics because you let your thumb rest across the string properly, but the decay of that note, how long the harmonics are going to last, all these things are kind of like random variables and variants and possibilities that are so interesting to explore. And what I've noticed is that, especially with the analog modules on the modular synthesizer, you can plug them in exactly the same way and try to get their settings pretty close, but because of the nature of the components, because of the nature of the electricity, because of the temperature in the house, reacts just a little bit differently. And then something that's really common in the modular world is the idea of using noise and then random voltage to change and allow the system itself to generate. People make what's called generative patches, right? So you can do this also with software. More complex software will do this, like a Reactor and Native Instruments, and then some of these other really high-end synthesizers. But my favorite thing to do with the modular is to create a generative patch where it's making the music itself. You just created kind of the way that the patch comes together, and you just, once it's all put together, you just let it go. And it will, over time, especially if you're using things known as quantizers, which will limit the amount of notes available to the VCO down to kind of whatever scale you set. If you just put the variance in, I want it to be this fast and I want it to be in these notes, kind of let it go and try different combinations of voltages going different places. You eventually create a self-generating musician. It itself is making the music. And what I really enjoy is when the random that's being generated isn't a digital random, it's an analog random. Throughout time, analog random has really, really intrigued people with the random number generators causing phenomena like throughout time, and people like, a large world event happens, such as like 9/11 or something. The random number generators tend to make numbers that are kind of alike. It just makes me wonder. I don't really know for sure, but it just makes me wonder, like when I make a generative patch, is what's happening in the world influencing this music that this device is making, and like...
Yeah, there we go. I've actually been working on that recently on Arduino for the first time over the summer, because I have some extra hours to dedicate to learning a new script and encoding technique, and I've been making this Arduino patch, or sketch, as it's called in the Arduino language, to create a perpetually randomized sequence of arpeggios based on a pentatonic scale that I've input, like by frequency for each data value. So it's not analog like you were just talking about, Anthony, but it is, in a way, alive when I listen to it. Like I can let it run for 10 minutes, and the cats like it too because it's high frequency, so they get down to it. I.e. are not bothered by it. They seem relatively intrigued and will actually come and sniff it. But I do feel like the randomization or the kind of generative aspect is really, really beautiful and intriguing to me, especially. And David, I'd like to hear your input on generative and arpeggios and other aspects of manipulating sonic data, man.
Sure. Well, I've worked for about 2 years at Moog, calibrating synthesizers. I worked on Mother 32s and Voyagers and Sub 37s. And I had the very fortunate chance to learn synthesis on a Voyager, which is an analog synth. And I think there really is something a little bit different about analog versus digital, and I think it has something to do with the fact that the signal path itself is a little bit closer to our biology than digital synthesis, in that, we have both AC and DC current systems in our body transferring information at essentially light speed. The resonance with an analog circuit that's operating in a similar kind of capacity, there's something that feels a little bit more alive, like you said, Anthony. And especially, I don't know how if you've ever tuned or calibrated any of those modules that you have, but when you are working on, say, like keyboard scaling, where you're programming the oscillator to respond sequentially up a keyboard and scale it so that each note is actually the distance that it's supposed to be in frequency, you get this almost living entity type response where you tune one part of it and the other part moves out, the top end moves out, and you keep just balancing these things back and forth, and it's like it feels very much like riding a skateboard or doing something where you're literally balancing with your body, and you can start to tune into these machines in ways that you really can't do with digital synthesis. And I've thought so much about that very idea of, well, how much is my consciousness affecting this machine as I'm interacting with it? And what's so interesting too is actually going back to this graphic you sent of from the Long Now. What's coming back into fashion right now is modular synthesis, but that's where synthesis began, pretty much. Looking at Bob Moog's work and John Buchla's work in the 50s and 60s, it was all modular, and then that went out of fashion, and the culture was very strongly influenced. And it's interesting how we see these resonant cycles and harmonics kind of create this matrix of time and relearning what was so beautiful about these machines with greater technological capability. Because I think when they first came out, I don't think there was the understanding that these machines are so special because we can resonate with them in a way that we can't with digital machines, because digital machines didn't exist yet. So we kind of had to go through the cheesy 80s DX7 bell sounds and all that good stuff to kind of arrive back at the point where we can really see the what's so special about these analog machines.
So, dude, this is the thing. This was the thing that I actually, when I went to Moog Fest back in May to give their talk on techno shamanism, and I met your buddy Amos Gaines, who works was a former coworker with you at Moog. This was the hub of the conversation, and the weird thing was that like the bow on the end of the weekend was that I missed this talk by Google's Magenta project. They're a group of people that are working on exactly what we were talking about earlier in this call, which is artificial intelligences that can make paintings and musical compositions and that kind of thing. There's a guy on that project, Adam Florin, who I somehow didn't meet at Moogfest, who designed a Max for Live patch called Patter, and Patter is a generative MIDI synthesis engine that's based on some of the artificial intelligence that he's working on at Google. So I came home and I was like immediately, like I actually had the weird sort of, after years of analog acoustic guitar modular synthesis with, guitar and a bunch of pedals, I had this thing where I was like, okay, time to graduate to software, because finally here's a system where I can not just interact or collaborate with the vaporous electrical ghost in the machine, but I can actually teach that ghost to speak a little bit, and that the new software, there's this sense in which there really is a collaborator in there, and that one of the other projects, I think it was Georgia Tech, actually has a robotic marimba player that looks at the other members of the band and bobs up and down and keeps time with them, and like you establish this band member relationship with this thing that's essentially just some script inside of a chassis. It's like we think we're establishing a relationship with the robot, but really we're establishing a relationship with this pattern of electrical current that's living sort of like it's moving through the robot. It's not the face of the thing. It's the thing itself is the stuff that, it's like when we start to think of ourselves as electrical systems, and Anthony, this is like, in a way, this is the cool thing about how this album, even though it's reaching back in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it seems like there's this, the way forward is backwards, in the sense of every Renaissance reclaims what was repressed by the previous Renaissance, And so we're getting back to all of this sort of like pagan and shamanic stuff where we're aware of ourselves as electrical, as like field-based entities, and that I'm sure everyone listening to this who's ever taken psychedelics around electronics is aware of how like shit just does not work the same way when you're tripping, and it's not that you're tripping, it's not that you can't figure it out, it's that your electrical field is different somehow, and it's like these electronics that we design are not designed to operate under those specs, Could
it also be, though, that the projection of you is altered in those states, and so because of that, your projection of yourself ends up interacting with the other projection that you call an electronic device, and that is just another way of kind of explaining the phenomenon, because I'm totally with you on that. Like cats, for example, when I'm in that state, cats tend to become more electronic in nature, and when they how they like their hair seems to, something strange about their hair specifically, it seems to stand on end a little bit more, and like it's almost as if I'm able to like statically interact with their hair, and their purring takes on a quality of almost a musical quality, and it's like but I know that the cat hasn't changed, you know what I mean? I just know that like the projection of myself interacting with the cat and my projection of the cat, or what I know to be a cat, I'm experiencing a different quality of interaction with that with that creature. And you could say the same thing, definitely about musical instruments. Sometimes it's like trying to play what did Jimi Hendrix say? It's like trying to play a guitar with a snake, you know, like when you figure snakes and you're just like, I don't know, like it points to a pretty rock solid belief that I've developed over the years, and that's that I think that there's a lot more to electricity in general than I think we give credit. I think we say that electricity is part of the human body, like mitochondria are creating the ability for us to like move, but then these electrical currents coming from the brain, you know, operating the nervous system. Yes, that's there, but I think that there must be a spiritual component, a soul component to electricity, because it's almost like one of the most blaring differences between a cadaver and a live person is the presence of electricity and electrical current. You know what I mean? And so that's another way that you could say that messing with this device, or you know, David with a synthesizer, just any device really, is the presence of that electricity is something that is kind of like a mirror to a living and breathing person.
Well, I know that Michael and I have talked about this before, but are you guys familiar with MIDI Sprout, data garden device that allows you to take subtle electrical signals from plants and transduce them into MIDI data?
I've seen that. Yeah, I haven't played with it. Do you have one of those?
It's actually out of a data garden in Brooklyn, and I have been in touch with Joe Peditucci, the head of data garden, about maybe doing something together on the horizon. But it also works with animals too. So if your cats are sleeping, you can put the electrodes on their little leg muscles, and while they're kicking in their dreams, you can actually record that information and transduce it into MIDI for later on, whatever you want to do with it. So it would be really fun to take it to a botanic garden, and hook it up to a bunch of different plants with the permission of the people present, and lots of opportunities I think open up with that. I just want to let my houseplants sit for weeks and dump all the data into a SD card and use that for something later on,
Dude, we can get to the bottom of this cat question too. We can.
Can we? Cats are very deep.
We can sonify their electrical data when we're in different states of consciousness, and then listen to the pieces of music that come out and see if they're any different, or how they're different, and therefore not only quantitatively but qualitatively evaluate whether it's because we're tripping or just that we're just tripping.
Man, you went a nosedive into the rabbit hole. That was solid.
Well, actually, I think what you would really need to do is sonify your own electrical data when you're interacting with a cat rather than its. Well, I guess you could do both. You should probably do both and make sure that they're consistent, that there's a change in both, and repeat that about 100 times.
You're the psychoacoustics expert, David.
Actually, it's really interesting you bring up the plant thing. I was just reading a book called Ancient Mysteries, Modern Visions, and it's about a guy who's done it's his account of his research on the round towers of Ireland. I don't know if you're aware that there are all of these round towers scattered across Ireland that are in a sky map type distribution where they mirror specific constellations. And he was doing this work in the 70s, and he was looking at the dielectric and paramagnetic properties of them, similar to how the pyramids are built and layered. And his theory on it was that they are essentially resonators of cosmic radiation designed to enhance the ability for seeds to germinate, agriculture to prosper, and generally be supporters of vibrant life. And so he built all of these little models of these round towers in the exact same dimensions, but just, did it in tiny little, scaled it down quite a bit, and found that, sure enough, the wavelengths correlated to where these combinations of stone would collect these resonant waves. And this was in the 70s, so he was hooking it up to a device that would trace out his voltmeter on paper. And he decided to use a fig tree to hook up to his voltmeter that was reading an incredibly small amount. It was like 0.0000001 volt, really sensitive instrument. And he was trying to detect solitons, or waves moving faster than light. People call them scalar waves, kind of moving into that territory. And he found that this plant, that using a fig tree as an electromagnetic resonator hooked up to one of his round towers, he could detect the bursts of these cosmic wavelengths from deep into the galaxy, and using the fig tree as an antenna, essentially.
Whoa. Total mind blown. That's awesome.
Round towers of Ireland, I had no idea.
Well, the fig tree thing reminded me of my desire to take this MIDI sprout, scale it up maybe if we need to capture things more subtly or on a larger scale, and go out into the woods, sample some redwoods, some really large organisms at different points, like map and route the electrodes at certain heights along a sequoia, for example, maybe out in the branches at different scales, and see how it behaves at multiple locations. And
Evan, if you do that, I would be so interested in hearing that.
Word. Well, I think it would be really fun to just scale it with people that are able to do that for you. I'd imagine that I wouldn't be qualified necessarily to go to the very top, but if I could, I would. That's something I've thought about with respect to larger organisms too. Like if you could set up these electrode systems to record the signals from, say, like a blue whale, which intriguingly enough have been spotted in the waters here in New York City recently, along with humpbacks and a few other species, which is a fairly rare event. So people have been able to actually go out even on the ferries here in the city and scope out some whale activity, which I thought was a really beautiful counterpoint, especially in the photos that have been posted of humpbacks breaching with the Jersey Shore in the background. There's that Star Trek movie where the alien probe comes back to make contact with the humpback whales, and we're thankfully not to that point where we've made them extinct. And if the probe were to come, theoretically, it would find them still here and be able to say hi. So we're doing all right as far as the humpbacks go. But I'll hand it over to you, Michael, on your next query, because I know you've got a lot of unique angles to take.
I'm still kind of blown by what David's saying here. This notion that's all the stuff that we're measuring. I was actually just thinking about that earlier today, oddly enough, that we're aware that we're unaware of X-rays and microwaves and all this stuff, and yet we still have this weird, pretentious attitude that there aren't other invisible realities around those that we're not going to discover with more sensitive instruments any day now, or haven't already been discovered and just been sort of repressed by the scientific paradigm.
Michael, do you want to talk about the Stranger Things? Is that what you're getting at on Netflix, or what's your angle here?
Yes. Yeah, we're about to turn this conversation upside down.
Ooh, into the upside down itself.
No, but that stuff is all based. That whole show is based on actual history in that weird kind of like X-Files fringe kind of way. That's based on Ingo Swann's remote viewing experiments, the protocols they developed with the CIA. So that stuff's all real. Anyway, David.
I'm right there with you. It's funny that to bring this back to where the conversation was a little bit ago, talking about the belief in higher metaphysical concepts in 2012 versus the worldview now. I feel as though I've gone in the opposite direction as you, Anthony, where I was highly skeptical of all that stuff then, and through personal experiences since then, my view of reality has shifted to incorporate things that are far stranger than I had anticipated. But Michael, we were talking about Dan Winter earlier today, just for a second. I wanted to send you guys this link, and if you scroll down to about halfway through the page, there's a waterfall graph and a couple graphs of sine waves, and he has a magnetical coil at the base of a tree, as well as an EEG on a human heart and forehead, and the person was attempting to meditate with the tree, and you can see that the waves emitted, the frequencies emitted from the tree and the human are in phase with each other. It's pretty interesting. It just totally goes in line with what we're talking about.
Well, there it is. Yep, we're gonna have to link to that. This came up in the recent conversation I had on Third Eye Drops podcast with Eric Davis, which for historical anchoring purposes was released today, August 2nd. I don't know when this will go out, hopefully soon. But we were talking about some research that was just published a couple of months ago, in which they took what they call circumcerebral magnetic fields. They put a helmet on with magnets arranged in a particular array. And Anthony, this has me thinking about what you were saying about the collective consciousness, or the field of everyone in that like Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab kind of way, weighing into the sensitive mechanisms of the synthesizer. Only it's like backwards, because what they found was they were able to get gamers who were separated, playing different modules. They were able to put them on helmets that were oscillating the like identical magnetic fields by basically putting someone's brain inside this magnetic matrix that's identical between the two helmets. That these people were playing through the game the same way, like they were scoring points at the same time, the same points at the same time. Like they were, like they don't. It's like they don't really. They weren't trying to my knowledge. This was co-authored by Michael Persinger, who is the guy who's done all the God helmet research on inducing spiritual experiences in individuals with magnetic fields. So I don't think that they don't have the technology yet to actually play somebody's brain like a video game in quite that way. It was the fact that they were like synchronized enough in their brain activity that they made the same decisions. And that they were like, they were suggesting actually that, I think if I read the paper right, it was like they were saying it may be evidence that because they were vibrating in synchrony, that they became quantum entangled.
To diverge really quickly to like a checking out at a restaurant or a grocery store or just like a big box store in general, like everybody tends to come up at the same time, or that tends to be a phenomena that is observed more frequently than, a nice run to the checkout and easy one-step process or whatever. Like I've definitely noticed that people tend to converge simultaneously, even like working on the other side of the counter. In the past, like when I was in high school working at a video shop and seeing everybody come up and check out their DVDs at the same time. After like 15 minutes of everybody just milling about, sometimes I wondered if it was like actually due to the music that we were playing overhead, that maybe everybody converged during the second hook or before the last chorus, or maybe during the crescendo or the key change or whatever. And I feel like people do respond highly to music, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, and a lot of it's mathematical and does interlace and correspond to certain brainwave functions and entrainment phenomena that have been observed on multiple levels, and even frequencies themselves can correspond or kind of create an entrainment on that frequency. That's where I feel like 432 hertz or 440 hertz, whatever your tuned frequency is, you can actually dance around in different ways, even in your own way, making your own keys, as Aphex Twin is known to do, using analog gear especially. So taking that to the next angle, Aphex released a Analord series back in the day, all vinyl, all analog, produced on hardware. And Anthony, I wanted to ask if you've listened to that or are familiar with Aphex and his influence on analog production.
Certainly. In fact, he was able to accomplish a lot of the music from that earlier time, not only through like modular gear, but through even writing his own software in order to like make it all happen. And it's pretty interesting that we find ourselves now in a situation where that digital aspect, I think a lot of that software he wrote was for digital control over the analog modules. And now, David was talking about how the modular has made a resurgence in fashion. I think is potentially because now a lot of analog components are controlled by a digital IC or like Arduino or something. And because that's happening, it's allowing a whole new world of control. There's modules now that are analog, but they will they'll configure themselves and then calibrate themselves, because they also within them have a square wave VCO that's digital in nature that always plays the same note. So it's self-calibrating. It makes me wonder what's next. Like, like we had analog circuitry, and then we created digital circuitry, which is actually it's analog components that make digital circuitry. We're talking about the next kind of big thing, and that's like quantum computing and stuff like that. And I wonder if that, of course there's going to be a whole musical component to that when it really grips the consumer area, when musicians have access to devices that can compute at these speeds. If we'll make it all the way back to Eurorack or 5U modular synthesis again, 100 years from now or something, because the modules are now using that technology. And it just makes me wonder if we're always going to find ourselves back here experimenting and exploring with this device and this living, breathing thing, because our technology has made our explorations of it relevant again.
Perhaps so. When it comes down to, say, artificial intelligence, maybe in a soft AI based on multiple layers of cascading algorithms that is generating its best guess as to what you might produce based on those inputs. And this is really going back to what you were talking about earlier, Anthony, about quantizing information and then really reducing it to a certain binary state or value, which is ultimately a derivative or a point access or sample of a much more complex wave pattern, which is indescribable in its beauty and nature. No matter how many electrodes you put on a blue whale or a sequoia, you're never going to capture what it means to be a conscious whale or sequoia.
Try me, bro.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll approximate the number of electrodes that will be required to give our best guess on that phenomena. But going back to the output of data, that we might in the future have the opportunity to, say, for example, get beyond generative and go back to a soft AI, or go forward to a soft AI based on our own patterns, and that the connection back to analog will always be refreshed based on the way that we can approach digital information and digital interface, which is, going to also the Arduino. The next step for me personally is to install put in a single button that will allow me to do a tap tempo, which I can also adjust via the software. But if I do the tap tempo and then go to a MIDI output, I can take that same generative pattern that I played before on the piezo, and actually output that into a analog synthesizer. And we have a few Moogs available in Brooklyn that I might do that with in the near horizon. What's with the sketch for Arduino and the code basically to generate that output and see what happens. And I'm much more interested to hear that than I am on the piezo speaker built into the Arduino, which is pretty non-quirky and not super interesting, or frequency range.
Sounds like it's 2012 in here.
Well, we're kind of going back. I think we all actually met around that time, to be perfectly honest. I think I met most of you in 2012 or 2011.
Yeah, that seems about right.
I want to take a total. Oh wait, David, are you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Evan, it sounds like what you're getting at is very much in the realm of how many different modalities or how many different ways of processing information can you connect together that might seem separate: digital, analog, biological systems. How many ways can you connect them? How fluently can you connect them? How can you expand on the limitations that each one has on their own? It sort of just seems like that's the crux of where all this is going to some degree, is sort of reaching back in time to when analog synthesizers had no digital capability, pulling it back into the present, and then reaching into the future when we have these completely fluid mind-machine interfaces, and linking all of these systems together in a way that really transcends the boundaries of what we are currently able to do. I think that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I think it's a very pragmatic or humanistic angle, in that it's not so much necessarily about the variations or the combinations of A to D, D to A, etc. processes, but more about how do we connect the human element to all of our various means of creation, all of our tools available to share what it is that is meaningful to us and could be meaningful to other people, and help those waking up in the morning who might be working a 12-hour shift like feel better about their day and get through it and be good, self-loving, and help them on their journey, whatever it is that they need. Music does assist, so whatever we can do, I think is a positive aspect. And how do we connect the human element to it? I think it's often the question with respect to a lot of different variations in fields of the arts. So
thanks to this conversation, I think I'm kind of realizing that something's possible. I think I'm going to order one of these MIDI sprouts because, when it comes to these different systems, there's a lot of translation devices available now. And so the MIDI sprout is changing, signal coming from a plant to MIDI. And there exists a MIDI to CV device that I have, which is how I do a lot of composition on the modular when it comes to keeping the notes volts per octaves, for example. And then that's the other thing. There's control voltage can then be quantized to a volt per octave scale, and then that scale can be played in a generative patch. I'm so interested in this now that I want to create a generative patch using my cactuses or something. I just want to see what, and then I want to see if there's like different music, and maybe I should make an album of different plant jams.
You want to do that together? I'm totally down.
Oh my god.
This is getting very nerdy. This is amazing. Thank you guys.
So you guys have, first of all, noting that there's, some recent research that shows that there are certain species of plant that actually do use acoustic vibration to communicate with one another.
I've heard about this, and they're roots.
Yeah, and so the question for me would be, like, okay, we've managed to sonify the stuff coming out of the plant through this, awesome, like Rube Goldberg, Frankenstein's laboratory setup. And then what happens when we turn it, or like, how can we tune the musical output of that system in such a way that it actually communicates something meaningful back to the plant?
Yes.
Because I'm super interested in, there's a fantastic TED Talk from a few years ago on the interspecies internet. I don't know if any of you guys saw that, but Peter Gabriel was one of the people involved in that situation, and Vint Cerf, who is one of the architects of the internet. And they're talking about creating computer interfaces so that dolphins and bonobos and other conscious creatures can participate in the internet, can participate in the society that emerges online. And you get into like dolphin votes and stuff. That I am all for that. Give the earth a real voice. Like, that's where we get back to this, like, oh, you gonna call yourself Earth Cry, Anthony? Let's we're gonna, like, I think album 3 you might actually like really like rise to a new conscious layer of that expression if the whole thing is to actually like what futurist George Dvorsky talks about as animal uplift. Like, if we're getting smarter, don't we have an ethical responsibility to pass that stuff down to the other creatures in our world? And it's a complicated conversation, but at least I think everybody agrees that the planet should have a voice in our political proceedings. And so maybe the way to do that is through music, is through getting people used to the idea first as an aesthetic or an artistic ideal.
Well, what's interesting is that there are now modules that you can connect to servos and control the servo via CV control voltage, and so you could essentially create a full circuit that this little, maybe you put a little duster on the end of the servo arm or something, and it just wiggles the plant a little bit very lightly. So you could have the plant go, I guess it would go like this. It would go electromagnetic voltage to MIDI to CV through the entire like modular system, quantized and creating kind of like human scaled notes, and then have one of the random noise generators that's kind of getting all kinds of aspects of it. Like, it's basic analog noise that, if you didn't know, has a speed. of generation. And so if you change the speed of generation, you get like higher pitched or lower pitched sounds, and kind of almost sounds like bit reduction in a way. You could feed that to the servo, which could just wiggle the little dusting arm and like mess with the whatever part of the plant, and it could like, you know, it could create a full like system. Because I do know that there are some plants that react to touch more than others, and that'd be interesting to see if there's a difference happening, and whether there's like a more or less notes being generated when the plant itself is getting wiggled. Because I'm noticing people on this website, the MIDI Sprout website, the guy, the way that he's like doing a performance is he's grabbing a leaf of this snake plant and pulling it and pushing it, and that's changing MIDI notes. So I wonder if that's pretty interesting. You could make the plant like edit itself or something. I don't know.
So
sorry,
but it's good. This is like, we're in it. We're in the thick of it, where it's like really we're really starting to. If you're listening to this like more than 20 years in the future, I'd be interested if you could like somehow ping us back and let us know just how close we are to the way that all of you guys are now thinking all the time about this sort of, like, I really, in a sense, I really do think that one of the things that we're retrieving as we move deeper into a, you know, densely networked artificial environment is that sort of jungle type consciousness, that jungle type spirituality in which we live in this like, you know, what Carl Sagan called a demon-haunted world. I think we can call it, you know, like an inspirited cosmos, or, you know, we recognize that we're just on the other side of the envelope from this major mystery, and one of the things that's characteristic of that sort of pre-modern jungle kind of perspective is that, you know, sense of everything being connected to everything else. So as our technological environments diversify and accelerate to the point where it really is like, we were joking about drone music before we started recording, and like, Evan, I thought you were talking about that video of all those little quadcopters that the guys at MIT or wherever, they programmed them all to play the James Bond theme, you know, and it's just like this notion that we're going to be constantly surrounded by all of these tiny little, like, these little robots. They're all carrying servers that are all running a mesh network, and that there's no central router. You know, it's all like little mini server router bots everywhere, and we're living in this sort of jungle of robots that we can reprogram and link to each other. Like Rainbow's End by the science fiction author Werner Vinge talks about this in terms of moving computers into our clothing. So every outfit you wear has a slightly different computational suite of abilities. He calls it ensemble computing. You know, so like maybe today, you know, you're going to wear a different shirt because you're going to be using different apps, you know, and it's got different sets of sensors on it. And so it weaves its way back into the fashion, and it becomes this thing that we're just constantly, you know, looking at our environments in terms of, well, how can we like rejigger this a little bit? How can we reprogram it and like move some things around and, you know, coax a different tune out of this room?
I just can't stop thinking about how all of the things that we're talking about in terms of interacting with our environment on a deeper and more subtle level, and tuning into plants and like reestablishing a vitalistic view of the world around us really does tie into all of these traditional indigenous ways of understanding the earth and interacting with it. And it's almost as if we've kind of had to take, at least in our current modern society, had to figure out how to get back to that place through our own technological ability and through our own micromanagement of the environment, and sort of the desire to break things down to the smallest component in order to see the big picture rather than coming at it from the big picture in the first place. But I think it's necessary at this point because we're very much at where we're at. So the only choice is to use the technology that we're creating and continuing to evolve with to deepen our connection to our environment if that's what you choose to do. And I find that to be a valuable and worthwhile pursuit with all of these technological gadgets, because otherwise I don't know what the point is.
Yeah, my favorite class to teach at this spot in Greenpoint called the Brooklyn Home of Music, or B Home for short, is the field recording class where we all go out and we knock on fences and drop things down little pipes and explore the East River shore on the Queens side and the Brooklyn side, and get out and even like talk to kids to see if they'll like throw their skateboard one more time in the wrong direction to make it like scatter in the way that makes it interesting recording. And like people are curious about it. Typically it's kind of like it's a field recording or a musical sonic approach to the Pokemon Go phenomena, where it's interactive with your environment and you're more curious, I found, about like the sonic possibilities in the objects and the environment and the people and the animals around you. If you take binoculars out in the woods and you're looking to go bird watching, chances are you're going to pay more attention if you have the binoculars on you and you're ready to go at any time to like zoom in and find something that you're interested in. A field recorder is much the same to me personally, so that's one element of interaction, and the same goes with something like a MIDI sprout, where you're actually kind of connecting to your environment. You're learning about the information and the musicality and the conversation, the interchange of energy going on all around you. And something Michael and I have talked about is looking at the electric universe type theory of the unfolding of the cosmos. And I don't know if you guys are that familiar with that concept. Probably, I would guess. Maybe
They're
we talked about this
wizards,
before.
man. They're wizards.
Yeah, well. So I'm more than
Wizard
intrigued to get
101.
your input on this Wizard 101 topic of the electric cosmos.
I watched, what was the doc? Have you seen Thunderbolts of the Gods?
Yeah, Michael sent it to me, actually.
I really enjoyed that because it kind of pointed to a potential electromagnetic nature of all things, including consciousness. And, I bought it, like, so fast because it just felt so... I don't remember the name of the scientist, but he's like the laughing stock of everybody, and like it's probably who knows what the deal is with it. But like I bought it because it felt so at home to me, because interacting with electricity is just it seems so natural. And I think what potentially might seem unnatural about interacting with electricity and life is just the interface. I was talking with Liam the other day, David, about how I wish that you could produce music on a laptop by doing like something aerobic, or like if you're gonna do a big like bass drop, you'd have to like wind some huge like like, heavy like arm or something like that, and you could like do it that way.
A giant Jack in the Box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or like when you're gonna like blow something up dynamite wise, like if you want to do like a big like transitional sound, you have to literally like stand up over the dynamite explosion box and like push it down. Like I wish that was in some ways I find myself sitting there for hours like, man, I wish there was a more aerobic, something required physical effort in order to like create these sounds. I think that musicians by and large would be healthier. What that all points to is that like I think that people look at a computer and they say, I'm typing and looking at this LCD screen, and they say this is unnatural, or they look at it and say this technology is it's destroying the earth. But I think it's the interface that needs the update more than pretty much anything else. It's the way that we interact with electricity and our technology that can benefit us. And you've been doing a lot of work, David, in that field recently. And I'm sure these guys would be really interested to hear like what you're presently working on.
Yeah, well, man, I could talk for electromagnetism for a really long time. I don't think we want to go down that rabbit hole completely. But I've been doing some work outside of Futexture, and I actually left Moog to take up this position as the director of applied psychoacoustics at a place called the Apeiron Center for Human Potential, which is a next generation wellness and human optimization clinic, essentially, kind of taking a multimodality approach with some pretty forward-thinking um, ways of looking at the human body. We do personalized precision genetics and nutrigenomics, and they're very interested at looking at how sound and light can positively affect the human organism. So that's kind of where I come in, and we have a three-dimensional speaker array and an anechoic chamber that you can be suspended in the middle of, that I'm designing some programs for, doing a lot of work with
wait. Tell people about the anechoic chamber, because this is totally key, I think. This is like this is the crown chakra of the conversation, if you will.
Well, it's a cylindrical room that's about 10 feet by 15 feet, and there is a 8-speaker array that's arranged in a star tetrahedron that you can be suspended in the middle of in a sling-type chair, so that your head is perfectly in this space-coherent bubble, because all the speakers are equidistant from each other. And we're looking at things like brainwave entrainment, specific frequencies to balance the nervous system, and really just kind of exploring what the actual physiological effects are on people, and how we can harness that for better health and functioning. And I've basically just been given the keys to pilot this incredible ship, and we have I have access to EEGs and all kinds of biomarker data while we do this stuff. So I was thinking we should totally hook people up, Anthony, while we're recording data from plants, and do some stuff similar to what Dan Winter was doing, looking at human physiological data and plant physiological data at the same time.
And how they interact, how they communicate, even, you know, how the data might change depending on where the human body interacts, you know, and in what way with the plant.
Oh my God, you guys! I have some plans that I need to cancel and come out to North Carolina and participate in some possibly world-shifting shenanigans.
Come on down.
Quick question, David. Does any of the... I'm not sure if you're calling it biofeedback, but what this MIDI sprout does is it reads the galvanic skin response, the GSR of a plant, and that's the data that it takes into the MIDI translator. Is that something that you guys are taking in those?
Yeah, we have that capability, and actually, I wonder if we could hook up our human galvanic response sensors to that as well, and what the inputs.
Yeah, it says on the website. I've been reading it while we've been going around here, and it says, when applied to a human, this is called a galvanic skin response. GSR readings provide insight into humans' inner emotional states and are the basis of the simple lie detector test. But all they did is they created a device that just translates it to MIDI. Interesting.
It's almost like the Voight Conf test in Blade Runner, or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, taking in multiple response variables from the physical body, and artificial intelligence test in the case of Blade Runner for these replicants, you know? Like, maybe at some point we could even apply that to a sufficiently complex hard AI bot trying to infiltrate a system, you know, see if it can sing a tune the same way as we might.
Dude, I just, thinking on that, it's just so obvious as someone who lives, 30 plus years ahead of that story's original conception, that if you're going to take all that rich multi-input data off of, your interviewee, like right now, all I'm getting is y'all's audio, and that's great because that's all we're sharing. But like if I was able to get your galvanic skin response and pupil dilation and infrared map of your blood flow and all that stuff, and all I'm doing with it is telling whether or not you're an android, that's like a cultural, or like that's a society level tragedy. Phil Dick would be pleased to know that in 30 plus years that we're at a point now where we're actually saying, well, if we can do all that, why would we kill the android? Why wouldn't we just sell them a bunch of stuff? Like, it's better to have them involved in the economy. This is the principle of public schooling. It's like it's better.
Is that the next pyramid scam where instead of printing more money, we print more androids to sell more things to make more money?
Print more people in this case, yeah.
Yes, Robin Hansen wrote a whole book about this, The Age of
Oh my God.
He wrote a whole book about how as soon as we it sort of worked that way. It's like as soon as we learn it can scan the brain and reproduce its activity in a computer, even before we understand it, then we can start massively reproducing, the best accountant in the world, the best elementary school teacher in the world, and then like most of the economy ends up being digital people, and so they all end up in this like extraordinary fight for subsistence wages, while the human beings living at normal human speeds become unimaginably wealthy. For like however long it takes for that whole system to like go up in flames and like eat the entire planet or whatever happens, it's like, yeah, but that notion of like, well, the most important thing is that we exploit our, godlike creations as deeply as possible. That's the economic logic of it, for sure.
Oh, that's funny. But that actually brings up the point of like, what do you start doing when what do you do with that data? What are the most positive outcomes you could think of to use from someone's real-time biologic data? And I've been working on some kind of like relational coherence type programs where you get multiple people hooked up to heart rate variability sensors and start to look at how long it takes people to entrain together, and how you can facilitate that entrainment. Because like I can't see you guys, as you mentioned. I'm just hearing your voice, and I wonder just through that interaction how much our physiological mechanisms have synced up, and what would be the technological implementation that would allow us to actually feel as though we were having a much more intimate conversation based on our body's ability to respond to each other in real time. I remember reading that people have really been trying to work on that since Skype, or since early internet video communication was happening, and the early attempts were pretty ill-designed and chunky. But I think that we're actually going to see some really interesting stuff come online in the next couple of years to make these type of conversations feel as though we're really sitting there with each other.
I hope so, because I miss you guys.
Yeah, I miss you guys too. Maybe we could put like an underlying field recording of a campfire in the background, have it crackling, and each of us can microwave a marshmallow, see what happens with that.
I was going to say that would be very successful, actually.
Word. Well, another thing that comes to mind is I don't know if you guys did this back in the day, or like we're in choir in high school, or maybe barbershop quartet, especially because we're four of us right now on the podcast, and thinking about the barbershop that I sung in my junior and senior year of high school, that element where everybody harmonizing simultaneously in a chord that is perfect but imperfect, and beautiful and resonant and physical as well with your fellow like friends that you like to hang out with, is a really special feeling. And music, live music especially, where everybody's jamming, and like Anthony with Papadosio, because I've seen a lot of your performances and been grateful to share a stage here and there, watching you guys from backstage and seeing how things were unfolding, and watching magic happen, where that element of communication, music itself, is maybe what at some point we might verify with our ventures into artificial intelligence and interaction with human consciousness and biology.
Thank you for that. But, we should try, since we're coming from 4 different directions, we should try to sing a 7th chord over the internet. I wonder if that's ever happened before.
Let's minor 7th or major 7th?
I guess let's just let the third. Let's go. Michael, sing the first note. Sing the.
Yeah. Well. One of the things that, again, in like Werner Vinge's Rainbow's End, that novel, he talks about that he actually has a scene in which people coordinate a real-time symphonic collaboration across the planet. And like we've seen a couple things sort of like this, like the YouTube Symphony Orchestra. That's like this massive centrally coordinated thing. And the idea being that eventually this is going to be just sort of how people ordinarily do it. except that you're going to have one or several of the participants in that situation sort of, rather than having a conductor, you'll have somebody who is kind of like switchboard operating, like shuffling people's data traffic through different avenues, through different like proxies and routes, so that everyone's latency lines up. And it's like this notion that that consciousness is the latency space where all of the different sensory latencies, like your eyes, it's quicker to get data from your eyes to your brain than it is to get data from the tips of your toes to your brain. And yet you have to experience all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And so in a way, we're just reproducing that what I guess like in ophthalmology or like the study of the eye and the brain, it's this notion of the flicker fusion frequency. So like your vision only updates every 1/25th of a second, which is why movies work, because it's moving faster than we are aware of it. It's like, well, the eye can move faster than that, but the problem is that the body is of a particular size, and that if the eye were moving faster than that we'd be out of rhythm with ourselves. Like we would be experiencing visual information as occurring more rapidly than touch or something. And so it seems like we're kind of getting into some terrain like that with each other as we become more networked. We're sort of building like almost like little neural networks between us, and forming little synchronized symphony groups. But we're not up to the major sevenths yet.
It might take some practice. It might take some practice, but if you all are down, maybe it's time to do some last minute wrap up and plugs, etc. We've been chatting for about an hour and a half, which I'd like to keep the entirety of, if possible, to have a nice long podcast for all of us to share these conversational, labyrinthine, logical inputs and outputs with everybody else who wants to chime in as well. And again, we welcome a lot of everybody's comments and input, but this is Future Fossils. And again, we have on the show David Krantz, Futexture, and Anthony from Papadosio, also goes by Earthcry, and just put out a new release.
That's awesome.
So why Sunpass as the title?
Well, I guess I kind of liken the ideas I think that you feel the most excited about, you give the most energy to, and when you give something excitement, I've noticed in my life at least that I accomplish things when I'm excited about something, and if I'm not excited about something, it does not happen. Like so I likened it to the songs that were available. Maybe I think there was I'm not exaggerating here. I think there were probably 70 different blahs that I thought would be cool ideas, and maybe still will end up becoming whatever at some point. But the ones that I was most excited about were the ones that I finished, and so I gave those the most energy. And the sun, if you know what a sun path graph is you can put it on on a laminate clear thing, and you can hold it up to the sky at the right distance, and you can see where the sun will be depending upon the season. And so I thought I was trying to make a name that sounded cool, but still kind of referred to what I was thinking of. Is that you want to position your your windows and your awnings and stuff like that in the right way, so that you get the right amount of energy from the sun at the right amount of times to heat and cool your house. It's used for solar systems and things like that. So I thought in some ways I'm like the sun, kind of looking at all my different ideas that are right there, and I'm moving across the specific thing, and I'm okay, so this idea is cool, that idea is cool, that idea is cool, that one's cool. So I've given those ideas the most energy, and so I thought the album itself was kind of my own personal little sun path, and I had granted energy to those songs enough to the point where I felt like they were finished enough to to send them off to mastering and then put them in an album. So I don't know if that makes any sense, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe I didn't think it all the way through.
Well, it does to me.
If it doesn't make sense, that's a problem, because it makes sense to me.
Well, I think like if anybody's interested in like passive solar for their homes, especially one interesting aspect, especially with respect to trees, is if you have a deciduous tree in the summertime, it helps to, if it's planted to the south of your home, provided you're in the northern hemisphere, protect and actually shield from excess energy from the sun, therefore keeping the home cooler over the summer when it's foliated or has leaves on it. And then during the winter, once it sheds its leaves, again, assuming it's a deciduous tree versus a coniferous, so like an oak versus a white pine, that the oak will shed its leaves and therefore allow more direct sun during the winter when you actually need to heat yourself in your home a bit more or a lot more. So SunPass for me is deeply connected to like doing a solar site assessment of somebody's property or their house and seeing how they might be able to put up an array of solar thermal or photovoltaic. And David, you used to have a solar thermal array on your rooftop, and are you guys still at that same spot?
No, we're actually at a new house. But yeah, that house was designed really well with passive solar, and the tree scenario that you're describing was very much implemented there. It is true what he says.
Cool. Well, anything else you want to plug before we kind of wrap up here for tonight?
Give us your websites, folks. And if you're thinking about this as like a time capsule to the future, and people or possibly extraterrestrial beings that like find this in the ruins of a city are listening, 1,000 years from now or however long.
10,000? 100 million?
Yeah. What? Not that they care what we consciously wish to tell them. They're more interested in our trash, probably. But what would you say to those distant future beings? And then also, what's your website?
Oh man, that's a tall order there.
And a good one.
The website one pretty easily. That's earthcry.net. But what I would say to distant future beings is, hey, we tried really hard. Help.
If you can, yeah.
Yeah, send help. I think that sounds good.
Send Rick.
Morty's waiting.
We are all Morty. Our culture is Morty.
We're all Morty. You can listen to my music at soundcloud.com/Futexture, Futexture, and you can check out Apeiron Center at Apeiron, Apeiron Center.com, and check out some of the offerings that we do. So yeah, hey, and thank you guys for having me on this show. This has been fantastic.
Yeah,
really enjoyed it.
We're not in the habit of like collecting every Pokemon guest celebrity. Oh, I got Graham Hancock. Blah blah blah. He evolved too. Dennis McKenna. No, it doesn't work like that. So
plus 30 ancient civilization points.
Yeah.
Minus 5 TED Talk points.
Oh.
Translate plant and skin signals to music, and we'll get back to you then.
Yeah, maybe actually, I'm going to be out on the East Coast this November. I don't know if you, maybe that's the trip to come visit you, David, and we can do another one of these in person.
Absolutely. You've got a place to stay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'll let you know if the MIDI Sprout is shipping by then. It seems like they're backed up on orders right now.
Yeah, there's been a really high demand for that, and they're actually working on the kind of Mark II path, and I'm thinking about approaching them with a different project as well. But Michael, I know you're going to be on that East Coast tour coming up here to New York and going to COSM, Alex Gray's Chapel of Sacred Mirrors. So
that's November 12th is the COSM date.
Yep.
And maybe I should try and put something together in Asheville while I'm thinking about it.
Do it up.
Yeah.
With anybody. Okay, guys. Well, this has been a super awesome. I think that was episode 10, which makes this the end of our first batch. Not that that prevents future human beings that are actually like MIDI operated DNA robots living, projecting out of the cloud. From binge watching all of this.
I don't think seasons will be too important at that point. I think once the binge watching kind of unfolds in 100,000, 10,000 years, etc., the seasonality of a program will not be as important in the binge watching process. So who knows?
Don't matter in space.
Yeah, but if anybody grabs this as a zip or finds it as a single archive season 1 with a end marker, a nice capstone here at episode 10, if we want to drop it at this point, which is maybe a good way to go. Thank you guys again, Anthony and David and Michael. Good to talk to you as always. This is Evan Skytree signing out for tonight.
So, survivor of the Starship Nostromo.
hopefully not. I mean, we're getting a remake of or sort of a redirection of Alien 3 coming up from Neil Blomkamp and maybe Scott himself. So I guess we'll see.
Hey, before I hang up here, I wanted to really juice on this website called futuretimeline.net. And I don't know if you guys have ever visited that place, but it's pretty rad. Yeah, that one. Sounds like you already have, Michael.
I think I've seen it. Let me see what I...
We'll link it in the show notes. We'll put a URL for people.
It ties more into the broad perspective of this being kind of like talking about time, and it actually even touched on some of the stuff you guys are talking about with how automation is slated to kind of take over our government. Our governments and our maybe even every other aspect of our flow chart here, like far off in the future, that in some ways will kind of like save us from ourselves.
This is interesting, yeah.
Pretty interesting stuff. I mean, like, and a lot of the information here is derived from all kinds of really cool resources, and they have them all like logged here, so it's not just a bunch of people just wanking off on a bunch of ideas. It's an actual like it's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. It's based off of a forum. So if you ever have something to contribute, I think you could probably get a lot of listeners for your podcast on this forum, because this is what these people are like interested in.
Oh, yeah.
Anthony, I appreciate you mentioning the Global Consciousness Project, the Friend of Number Generators. That particular thing I found, I think I was in like 11th grade in high school, and I found that website, and it just completely like blew my mind. It opened my world up. Like, that was the thing where I was like, oh my god, what so that has a special place in my heart.
Nice. This all sounds like fairly accurate, even if it's not like totally on board with the timeline. I feel like the specific dates, I feel like everybody kind of knows what's coming at this point. I mean, that's the weird thing about it, is that I know I gotta go and you gotta go, but like, just think about 2012 and now. And it's like, I think the difference is that like, it felt super mystical to talk about this shit in 2012. Now it doesn't. Now it just feels like mundane. Like, we're like, oh yeah, and then like when we're all like on a ketamine prescription, riding around in driverless cars, like forming like
what kind of dystopian world do you live in, man?
I don't know what you're talking about, man. But at any rate,
yeah, likewise.
Well, and that's the thing, is like, if it's really going to be totally different, it's gonna offend our sensibilities. But anyway, I love you guys. This was super fun. We do these pretty irregularly, but if you're ever feeling like you've got some new thing that you want to rap about, or you just want to join the conversation, we're down to have you back as guests when we're interviewing someone else. I think we ought to start just getting in the habit of that. Have a great night.
Good night.
Done here, and we may not ever figure it out. We probably won't figure it out. I mean, probably one person in their lifetime never really does, and maybe even as a species we won't have it figured out when the time comes, whatever that may be.